Today's presentation is Medical Device Recalls and Part 806, The Importance of Getting It Right. My name is Sarah Dyson, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Loss Control for the Medmarc Insurance Group. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Steve Niedelman, thank you for joining us. Steve serves as the lead quality systems and compliance consultant to the FDA and Life Sciences practice team at King & Spalding. His specialty is regulatory enforcement and policy matters involving industries regulated by FDA. He provides strategic advice, insight, and guidance to the medical device, pharmaceutical, biologics, and food industries to ensure compliance with the requirements of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Steve retired from FDA in 2006 after a 34-year distinguished career, where he served as the Deputy Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs and as Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Regulatory Affairs. While at FDA, he ensured consistent interpretation of FDA's regulatory policies by directly overseeing offices at the headquarters of the Office of Regulatory Affairs, including the Office of Regional Operations, Office of Enforcement, and Office of Criminal Investigations. Additionally, Steve assisted in the day-to-day management of FDA's nearly 3,400 field staff responsible for investigative and laboratory operations. I'm also happy to say that I've known Steve personally for several years. He's been a great friend to Medmarc's Loss Control Department, and I really appreciate his time and his efforts for us today. So with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Steve, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about a subject that, quite frankly, despite everybody's best intentions, everybody needs to be prepared for. Invariably, at some point, a particular situation will arise where a decision will need to be made with regard to whether or not a recall action or a field corrective action needs to take place. The purpose of this webinar is to hopefully dispel some of the confusion surrounding Part 7 authority, 21 CFR Part 7 authorities, Part 806, the different recall authorities that FDA has, et cetera. Recalls continue to abound at FDA. You will see on the last slide of the presentation the volume of recalls that do take place each year, although there's been a slight dip in the last couple of years. We have a lot of information to cover today. We're going to have some hypothetical questions throughout the presentation. So with that, I would like to get started. So the General Recall Authority for all products that FDA regulates, devices, drugs, veterinary products, cosmetics, foods, tobacco, etc., can be found at 21 CFR Part 807, which is the guidance on policy, procedure, and industry responsibilities that's part of the FDA's enforcement policy. It defines what is not a recall. It defines the classifications of recalls, Class 1, 2, or 3, how to conduct a recall, FDA responsibilities to provide public notice through their FDA enforcement report that's published weekly and available to the public as to what products have been recalled and their classification. But it does not have the effect of law or regulation, even though it appears in the Federal Register. It is only a guidance, and it represents the agency thinking on the matter. So a good part of it can be considered voluntary, and as a result of the voluntary nature of that, Congress saw fit to develop unique device recall authorities under 21 CFR Part 806 because firms were not voluntarily complying with Part 7. They were not reporting recalls to FDA in a timely manner. And as a result, FDA would go in and do an inspection and find that recalls had 3, 4, 5, 6 recalls had been conducted since the last time they were at a firm. They have the obligation to publish those recalls in an enforcement report. They were not timely reports because the recalls had already taken place. It caused confusion throughout the industry. Is this a new recall, the same recall, et cetera? So Congress, in their infinite wisdom, developed 21 CFR Part 806, Medical Device Reports of Removals and Corrections. It does require medical device manufacturers to report within 10 days of decision to take an action to reduce a risk to health. That is typically Class 1 and 2 recall scenarios, which does get a little bit gray when there's a Class 2 versus Class 3 scenario. But you need you're obligated to report those actions to FDA within 10 business days of the decision. That decision is not when you send the letter or when you notify your customers. It's based on the decision to take the action. So please keep that in mind. You'll be hearing that several times throughout the presentation today. FDA also has mandatory device recall authority, which was totally unique to devices and is now available to the food industry and certain infant formula industries as well. Interestingly, other sections of FDA have lobbied to get this authority, especially in the pharmaceutical area, and Congress has not been providing it to them. It's been in effect since 1990. There have been less than 10 times that this authority has been used by FDA. These are reserved for Class 1 recall situations, the most significant recall, greatest hazard to health, when a firm will not voluntarily take action on its own. Understand that 99.999% of all recalls undertaken in FDA-regulated industries are voluntary actions. This process does provide FDA the opportunity to notify a firm to stop shipping a product, basically a cease and desist order with an opportunity for a hearing. If the hearing is not requested by the firm, the agency may act on its own. If not, if there is a hearing, it is a Part 16 evidentiary hearing, and as an outcome of that hearing, they may order the firm to recall the product. Again, used less than 10 times since enacted in 1990. There are a number of recalls. There are a number of other regulations that contribute to recalls and may be associated with recalls because they get drawn in as a result of problems with, for example, design control under the quality system regulation if a device is not designed correctly, or there have been product or process changes and they haven't been well validated. Or their acceptance activities are inadequate and you're receiving product from suppliers that are not meeting your specifications and resulting in device failures. Similarly, open CAPAs may be feeding information that may result in recalls because upon your investigation and root cause, you've identified a problem that could raise a risk to health in the marketplace. Obviously, complaint files and investigations and service activities, which should not be dismissive of, are key elements of feeders of information that could result in potential recall situations. You need to keep your thumb on that and be able to know how your product is being used in the marketplace and the success of not causing any additional risk. Obviously, medical device reporting should be trended, those complaints that raise a risk to health. It's tough, let me tell you, it's tough to argue that your particular situation does not raise a risk to health if you have submitted MDR reports to FDA stating that failure to correct this malfunctions, obviously when a serious injury has occurred, it's already an injury, but malfunctions that failure to correct may result in serious injury or death, and then tell people that it is not a serious injury when the incident arises. Pre-market notifications, when significant changes are introduced, it may raise issues, same thing with PMA supplements. And for those of you who are operating under tracked device orders, those also may contribute to the need to issue recalls to those patients that are included in your tracking program associating with any risks. So what's a recall? And this is fairly important. It's a removal or correction of a marketed product in violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, against which FDA would initiate legal action unless voluntary action is undertaken when it determines the device is misbranded or adulterated. It must have a violation of the Act for any action to be considered a recall. It's not clear as to what would be that bright line when FDA would initiate legal action against a firm if they fail to take that voluntary action. In fact, there's been an FDA AMI initiative ongoing on post-market risk management, where Dr. Shuren, who's the director of the Center for Devices, has asked this group to try to define that bright line so that firms would know when they are at risk of a potential legal action if they fail to act accordingly. Obviously, recalls are a very efficient means to remove or correct a consumer product in the marketplace, and it's certainly less costly and less risky from from a brand loyalty and a brand exposure and brand trust situation, if you're having to fight an enforcement action to remove a product from the market, such as a seizure, when a voluntary action could have addressed it in a much more friendly and cooperative manner with less adverse publicity associated with it. So a removal under corrections and removals means the actual physical removal of the device from the point of use for its repair, adjustment, relabeling. You have to bring it back to your service depot. You need to bring it back to your firm. Whereas a correction, the correction can take place in the field. So the report, the modification, the relabeling, perhaps destruction or inspection of the device can take place at the healthcare facility. Obviously, capital equipment that's permanently installed would be corrective actions. There would be corrections associated with that. Other products where it's not as simple to do and you do need significant rebuilding of the device, you may need to return those devices. So FDA just distinguishes between removals and corrections just for the sake of identifying them, but one and the same, they are considered recalls by FDA. FDA classifies recalls according to 21 CFR Part 7, and this is consistent with all products that FDA regulates, as Class 1, 2, or 3. Class 1 is a reasonable probability that the use or exposure to the violative product will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. Reasonable probability means that it's more likely than not that an event will occur. That may be what it says in black and white, but it is not the situation it is not in practice what FDA follows. They look at the severity of a particular problem, and you will see there have been recalls with an N of 1, where one person died as a result of the use of the device, resulting in a Class 1 recall. And these are for devices that were out on the market for a considerable period of time. And so don't place a lot of confidence in that reasonable probability definition. Class 2 devices, which represent the majority of recalls that FDA classifies, clearly the overwhelming majority, it's a situation in which the use or exposure to the device may cause temporary, medically reversible adverse health consequences, or the probability of serious adverse health consequences is remote. And least serious are Class 3, which are not likely to cause adverse health consequences. Many firms have their own policies that Class 3 recalls are not reported to FDA, since under Part 7, 21 CFR, Class 1 and 2 recalls shall be reported to FDA, and Class 3 recalls should be reported to FDA. 21 CFR Part 806, removals and corrections, does not apply to Class 3 situations. However, there's certainly a gray area between clearly distinguishing Class 2 and Class 3, and you need to make sure that you have that lined up and documented, because FDA will clearly look at and review your non-reportable decisions when they do an inspection, and can, if it's not well documented as to what your decision was or there's a basis for your decision, can easily escalate that to some other situation, enforcement situation, for failing to file reports under Part 806. So what is not a recall is just as important as to what is a recall. So corrections and removals, Part 806, and recalls under Part 7 do not apply to market withdrawals, which is a firm's removal or correction of a product which involves a minor violation that would not be subject to legal action by FDA, or involves no violation, such as normal stock rotation practices, routine equipment adjustments, repairs, etc., normal preventive maintenance type of work. What's unfortunate is the term minor violation has never been defined by FDA. We don't know exactly what a minor violation is. So it's very, FDA uses its discretion in interpreting that, and I would suggest that industry err on a conservative definition for their purposes. Similarly, a stock recovery is also not a recall, and that's a firm's removal or correction of a product that has not been marketed or is not left at direct control of the firm. The product's still located on your premises, it's still under your control, and no portion of that lot has been released for sale or use. So, for example, if you have a lot of 100 units and you ship one, that product, if a problem arises, would not be a stock recovery, since the entire lot is not in place. It is one part of it has been released for distribution. Therefore, the rest of the lot is considered having been held for sale. There are many firms that use logistic facilities today and order fulfillment providers. If the manufacturer is the decider, they are the ones who pull the trigger as to which specific product to release, which lot numbers, etc. Stock recovery can also cover product held at logistics providers. However, if the logistic provider decides which products they're going to ship, stock recovery would not apply to them. So it's all about control by the manufacturer going forward. So we're going to go through a quick hypothetical here. A sales rep receives the same complaint from two customers that the tip of the SuperSleek cannulae device fractured before surgery. He retrieves all SuperSleek cannulae that the customers have in stock and replaces them to address the complaints. Is that a removal or a correction? That was a removal. I don't know what's I apologize. This would be considered a recall, and it would be because they are removing defective product that is violative from the market. Another situation, Fast is another manufacturer realizes that it printed some inaccurate information regarding the manufacturing date and location on the packaging for several lots of SuperSleek cannula, and it sends a corrective letter and label to users. So in this situation, is that a removal or a correction? Did they bring the product back, or is the action being taken in the field? Since it's sending a corrective letter to its users, it is a correction. Now, I apologize that the animations don't seem to be working. The next hypothetical we have is a misprinted package is identified while the affected devices are still in fast warehouses. They have all the affected devices under control. Is that a recall or a stock recovery? The answer, as you can see, is stock recovery because none of the product had been shipped. It's all under their direct control. So it's important that you understand the distinction between these going forward because FDA will clearly, they will push the buttons on some of these issues as they conduct inspections. And you want to be able to get through an inspection regarding recalls as smoothly as possible. Typically, FDA will conduct a follow-up inspection in those situations when there's a Class 1 recall. And it's in your best interest to be as transparent as possible during those inspections and to share as much information with them as you can, and at the same time, become very transparent to your local recall coordinator at the district office. They actually can provide you a lot of help. They are there to provide you help. They want to make sure your package is complete. They will work with you to assure that it is before they submit it to the Center for Classification. So how do firms become aware of recalls? Obviously, there are a lot of feeders that come into firms. There's a lot of different sources of information and data. Trending information, seeing shifts in trends, spikes in complaints, spikes in service reports, parts usage, etc. These are all, these are all indicators that there's a potential problem brewing, that it's percolating throughout your firm. The obvious ones are obviously if you start seeing a upward trend in complaints, service reports, specific parts usage that is all of a sudden out of the ordinary. It's your responsibility to mine and monitor peer review literature. And if there are known problems out there, it's your responsibility to investigate those problems and determine whether field action is necessary. If you're seeing an increase in nonconformances within your manufacturing and you're not addressing those, perhaps other manufacturing issues such as sealers on sterile packaging that can result in Class 1 recalls, or other manufacturing issues associated with equipment that can result in defective product that's adulterated or misbranded. Environmental issues, perhaps your HEPA filters are not adequate, or there are other contributing environmental factors that can result in a field action. New product evaluations that have identified a problem, packaging complaints, especially sterile barrier, very critical, and any other new information. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but the intent is to sensitize you to all the different feeders that you should be monitoring and mining to see if a problem is escalating within your firm. How does Cdrh become aware of recalls? obviously submitting 806 correction and removal reports by yourselves. During FDA inspections, they may uncover new trends in your complaint files. They will slice and dice your complaint data, whether those inspections are routine QSIT inspections or they're directed for a particular reason. Consumer complaints that come to the agency about a particular problem with a product that a consumer has been having, MedWatch reports that are filed directly with the agency by healthcare facilities, MDRs. The Office of Surveillance and Biometrics does monitor MDR reports and looks for trends and spikes. And actually, that information is used as the agency sometimes focuses on industry-specific issues. Information received by a firm, a repackager, or a distributor. Similarly, competitors. There's a lot of sharing of information with FDA within the industry. Certainly within your competitors, it's in their best interest to try to not shine you in the best light. Internal device reviews that the agency may be doing on an industry-specific effort. MedSun reports, mutual recognition agreements, and other country agreements. And as the regulators in the foreign countries continue to share more and more information, this is increasingly a source of information for the agency. And for those who manufacture radiation-emitting medical devices, radiation products reports under 1004 is another avenue for FDA to become aware of potential recall situations that require further investigation. There's no magic number that may trigger the need for a recall. As I mentioned before, there was recently a client of ours that had a single catastrophic event that resulted in a Class 1 recall. It was a device where the device failed. It wasn't easily discernible by the user. They didn't want to increase their liability or risk, and they took the right action to stop further use of the device. Actually having injuries is not necessary for a recall. You're better off being proactive to reduce your liability. So in the overall scheme of things, the potential severity of the particular situation is of the greatest importance versus frequency. If it does result in catastrophic events, the agency does expect you to act in the appropriate and take the appropriate steps in those situations. There's a temptation to rationalize the extent of use to minimize the rate of events within industry. I encourage you to resist that temptation. Devices are intended to work for their expected life of the device. You should establish an end of life for your devices. It's in best practice to do that during your product clearance. For those of you who say our products are guaranteed for life, unfortunately, you're stuck with the liabilities that go and the upkeep that's necessary to keep those devices going forever. Expired warranties are not an excuse to not do the right thing. That's solely a financial commitment to your customer. It has nothing to do with your doing the right thing. As you can appreciate in automobiles, your warranty may have been expired, but certainly you're notified of risky situations. Don't depend on physicians to know what to do when the device fails. Any expert physician would know what to do. They could be distracted. They might not notice it. They're not expected to fix. Not every physician is of the same caliber. Don't make those assumptions. You don't want them to be distracted from taking care of some other critical function during a procedure or a surgical event. So don't depend on that as a rationale for not taking action. The important thing is, in anticipation of a recall, you should have an established algorithm within your own firm for triggering that action. Don't wait until it's too late. Make sure that you have this all well baked before the situation arises. When we talk about end of life for devices, what the agency considers end of life is you will not service the device anymore. You will not make parts available for the device anymore. And that if any continued use of the device is not at your risk, but at the user's risk going forward, and that you have provided notification to the user that end of life will occur within a certain period of time, so they have opportunity to make changes and update their device going forward. Under the recall corrections and removals requirements, triggering events are important from an FDA perspective. You need to submit a written report your local FDA district office in a very prescriptive manner laid out in the CFR with either a C or an R preceding your number of action that you're taking based upon the year that the action is being taken, of any correction or removal initiated to reduce a risk to health or to remedy a violation of the Act caused by the device that could present a risk to health. Again, Class 1 or 2 recall scenarios. How do you know whether it's a Class 1 or 2 recall scenarios? Class 1s are pretty easy. Serious injury, risk of serious injury or death. Class 2s may be a little bit grayer, but take a look at FDA's database on recalls. Take a look at the total product life cycle part of FDA.gov to see if your competitors have had similar recalls and how have they been classified. Make sure you as well do your own health hazard evaluation, your own health risk assessment, so that you have a firm basis to stand on your decision that it is or is not reportable. Again, Class 3 recalls are not reportable. Under 21 CFR 806.10, you need to submit that report within 10 working or business days, not including federal holidays, of initiating such correction or removal. 10 days is from the decision to take action. So I encourage you to build as much into your process before you finalize that decision, because those 10 days go quickly. And if you don't have your ducks lined up, you are not going to get that information in a normal semblance of order to the agency in that 10-day period. So bake as much pre-decision in anticipation of a correction or removal before you sign that document. So it's important as well to understand, this applies to all firms, what a firm's recall strategy is expected to encompass under Part 7, the recall guidance. It needs to consider the depth of the recall, how far in the distribution chain is it going to the patient, is it going to the healthcare practitioner, is it just going to the distributor, the wholesale level? Is a public warning necessary to alert the public that the recall product presents a serious hazard to health? In all Class 1 situations, with rare exceptions, typically the agency expects a press release to accompany your recall notice. You want that press release to be robust, but you do not want it to be promotional. If they don't like yours, they will issue theirs, and if they issue theirs, guess who the press wires are going to accept? They're going to accept FDA's press release, not yours. Effectiveness checks verifies that you are expected to do effectiveness checks when FDA classifies your recall. They will tell you what depth of effectiveness checks they expect. Sometimes it's 100%. That all consignees receive the notification of taking the appropriate action. Again, FDA will conduct its own audit checks to verify that information. The strategy specifies the methods to be used to conduct the recall. It'll be by certified mail, by verifiable receipt letters, emails, phone calls, etc. Do not recommend emails or phone calls. It's very difficult to trace actual accountability for receipt by the individuals to whom it has been addressed. And being trapped in voicemail boxes does not provide you good documentation should FDA challenge whether or not a consignee has been notified. So established recall procedures, and again, strongly encourage that you have recall procedures in place. Hopefully never need to be used, but they should include the recall team that will be included. It should be a cross-functional team, the name of individuals or positions that will have substantial involvement in the recall, folks from quality, from medical or clinical ops, design, R&D, marketing. It really is important that you get the input from all of these people because it does affect the overall business position of your firm. There should be a recall coordinator who is responsible for the recall that will take the lead on assuring that the recall is being managed, it's being updated, that they're continuing to collect information, that if there are any gaps in responses, they're on top of it. It will properly identify the product that's been involved. To the extent that you can, you want to bracket your exposure and limit your liability so that you can identify when the problem started and ended, and then the description of the problem that created and resulted in the necessary recall. What becomes the critical part of this is the assessment of hazards. Firms are expected to do, when there's an increased risk to health, a health hazard evaluation, the likelihood of injury occurring as a result of the problem, serious of that injury likely to occur if the problem continues. You need to consider the benefit risk of removing implants, for example. Is there greater risk to having that additional surgery than the problem of any product failing? You need to consider medical necessity situations. If you are the largest provider of a particular mode of healthcare, a therapeutic value, and it comes off the market and you're creating a shortage and people will be denied healthcare. FDA is very conscious of that. They don't want to create medical shortage situations. They need to be assured of the quality of the products that are going out there as well. It's important that you know whether or not customers will be able to easily identify the lot of the recall product. You provide information as to where they can find the lot number and what degree to which the deficiency is obvious. It's not just simply buyer beware. Yeah, it may break, it may not. If there's a way you can identify what to look for, that's important. And then there are going to be a lot of failures, especially software issues, electrical issues, et cetera, that you're not going to be able to visibly see. And those increase the risk of those particular situations even that much more. So also you should be assessing the degree to which product remains unused. The amount of product involved, the last shipment date, the usage patterns. Anticipate what the usage rate is and be careful not to mix units sold with units used. You might not know how many were in fact used. You do know how many were sold. To the extent that you have a better comfort factor knowing that you're delivering these hand to mouth, that is, the need is constant, that's great. And that, you're just delivering as needed or customized for a particular order, that's great. But, if you ship 1,000 units of something to a particular large-scale hospital, those may sit on the shelf for a long time. So don't anticipate that they've been used up. You really need to understand what's the run rate as far as usage versus just sales. It's important about the continued availability of the product, whether the current production is affected, whether shipment was stopped, what containment has been put in place. Is the product on hold? Is it in quarantine? Is the product medically necessary? You need to consider that if a part needs to be replaced or repair needs to be made, what's the length of time it will take to get that done? If you need to have a new part redesigned or your supplier of parts is undergoing a major remediation initiative and it'll be 6 months before you start receiving them, you need to consider all of those situations as you prepare your recall strategy so that everybody is on the same page with regard to expectations from when repairs will be made. And does the person need to stop using the product until that part is available, or are there mitigations that can be put in place temporarily, short term, to provide continued availability of that product? Investigation and corrective actions. FDA will no longer close out a recall unless you have identified that root cause and shown that that issue has been corrected. They no longer want to see repeat recalls for the same reason at the same firm. So it's important that you do identify that root cause. You need to conduct a product reconciliation, the amount of product released for distribution with the amount of product shipped, and resolve any discrepancies. Some of that product may have been used for samples. It may have been used for trunk stock. It may have been destroyed in a flood. You need to be able to account for product manufactured and that was released for distribution versus the amount shipped, so that the agency has confidence that you're not hiding product that stays out there. And then state whether all the customers who receive the product have been identified. This is sometimes more challenging than necessary, especially if you're still dependent on paper-based systems. You need to consider the depth of the product action. Will it be to the user level? Will sub-recalls be needed by distributors? That is, they have their own customers. They will sub-recall to them and get product back and return to you. You need to describe the planned actions, whether this is a field correction, whether the product will be removed. Are you asking people to destroy it in the field? Will you repair it in the field? Will it be reconditioned perhaps as a non-medical device? Or will the product be destroyed? Or will it be fixed during the next preventive maintenance service? And sometimes that is the appropriate answer depending upon what the fix is needed. You just need to account for those devices that are not under preventive maintenance contracts, because those products still need to be repaired aside from those that do come in for preventive maintenance. And then whether or not a public announcement is necessary and what format that will take. Keep your websites up to date. Certainly if there's a press release that's issued, it's in your best interest to also include it on your website, as more and more people are dependent upon accessing websites for information. Types of notification, again, there are going to be situations for some of you who manufacture devices where it's important that that information be communicated through a physician to reduce anxiety or perhaps to explain to the patient the risks associated with the use of the device because of clinical implications. It's important that you identify whether or not you're going to notify, in those situations, monitoring physicians or implanting physicians. Many implanting physicians lose contact with their patients, and they do go on to monitoring physicians. And perhaps monitoring will be needed, patient monitoring, to reduce the risk because explantation of the device would be too risky. And so, again, with each type of communication, it's your responsibility to describe its contents. Very clearly and very succinctly, and this is all laid out in a model letter in the Regulatory Procedures Manual that we encourage firms to follow. It's the safest and easiest way to follow it, to create recall communications as to why the product is subject to recall, why, what product is subject to recall, why, that whether or not the product should stop using the product immediately or through some level of mitigation, or is it requiring patient monitoring, et cetera. You need to identify the product, describe it, its size, its lot number, its serial number. Most importantly, it cannot be promotional. Do not take this opportunity to say that your firm markets the safest, most valuable devices on the market, and we're looking forward to the release of the next generation of something. These are to be very straightforward and factual letters that go out, and we recommend them to be reviewed by an independent set of eyes, whether it be your legal team, whether it be your spouse. Make sure it's understandable. Sometimes people get too close to a situation and they lose track of the contents. Generally, again, Class 1 situations are expected to come across with a press release. There have been situations where the public really isn't involved and a press release would be of no value, and it's your opportunity to convince the agency why that is appropriate. Again, press releases should not be promotional. They need to be factual, and if they're not, FDA will issue their own. And we always recommend that you get FDA's input into your press release. FDA will not ask for your input on their press release, so make sure it's in your best interest to do it right the first time and take FDA suggestions. Don't try to shortcut it or change promises as it goes forward. Again, keep those on your website as well. The returned product as a result of the recall should either be reconditioned or destroyed. If you're going to recondition it, I suggest you get that plan approved by FDA before you go through the expense only for them to disapprove it. Make sure that the violation that's causing the recall has been addressed. If it's being reconditioned or if it's being destroyed, make sure that you're not in violation of EPA guidelines, OSHA guidelines, other local ordinances or requirements. You don't want to wind up creating more problems for yourself. Sometimes it requires dismantling devices if they're going to be destroyed before they can be dumped or put into a landfill. You need to know what those requirements are. Make sure you maintain accountability of product shipped versus returned. Don't expect 100% of product to come back. We have seen situations where 30% of the product has come back, and after various good faith efforts, 3 good faith efforts, sometimes 4 and 5, including physical visits by sales reps, they don't do much better. It is what it is. But as long as you can document your efforts, and that's why it's important to always use some verifiable means of communication. Effectiveness checks. FDA will require you to conduct effectiveness checks associated with the recall. Sometimes it's 100% effectiveness checks. You need to visit all your consignees. They're going to need to be included in your recall closeout action that you'll file with the agency. And again, it's when most or all the accounts have responded to. In those situations where you don't get response from a particular consignee, make sure you document all your good faith efforts. You can always notify the agency that this particular firm has not been responsive or this distributor refuses to sub-recall, and they will take it from there. But again, it's all about your documentation, and that's why we don't encourage using emails or telephone calls where you really don't know who you're speaking to on the other end, or your email may be answered by a secretary or an assistant that does not understand the importance of the particular situation, or that person is on vacation and is not reading their emails. So it's important that we always go to verifiable response information. Notify the FDA district office when you're ready to recondition or destroy. They may decide they want to witness the destruction. Some districts have been using that as a training exercise for their investigators. But again, be mindful of other federal agencies and local and state agencies as well. So HHEs, or health risk assessments, should be conducted to evaluate the risk before any recalls, stock recoveries, safety alerts, etc. These are really critical to determine whether or not there's a health risk associated with the use of your device. They should be based on objective evidence of the device, its intended use. They should be evaluated by clinical staff. And not everybody is going to have full-time clinical staff on their payroll, but you may be able to contract with a physician, a nurse, a veterinarian, et cetera, to help you understand the risks associated with the continued use of your device. You should have established health hazard evaluation procedures requiring appropriate sign-off. And at the end of the day, if there's any indecision about who needs to take action and you're constantly gnawing at the same issues week after week, you really need to have one person who's accountable that makes that decision and makes the decision on behalf of your firm. Languishing decisions is no excuse from an FDA perspective. They expect you to work quickly and they expect you to work efficiently. So it's important that you move that forward as well. So going forward, what's the difference between an HHE and a health hazard evaluation and a health risk assessment? Just for clarity, HHE is a tool that FDA uses and industry uses to classify a voluntary recall, determining the risk to health. An HRA, a health risk assessment, is a tool for predicting the possible harm that can come from a defective or malfunctioning device. Both use the same forms. Are just used for different purposes. So typically an HRA is used in anticipation of a recall. Do we have a problem here? Do we need to take an action? It's more of a predictive measure than the HHC, where you've made the decision to take the recall and now what are the risks associated with it. We encourage you to use FDA's recall HHE form that's available on their website. You might as well, if you're going to conduct this, be consistent with the agency as far as what your questions that you're asking and how those are being evaluated. When you make that health hazard evaluation, you need to determine as well whether or not the issue was included in your risk management files and your FMEAs. What was the severity? Is it consistent with what you anticipated in the design of your device? Or are you seeing catastrophic outcomes for what you thought was going to be your low risk or a medium severity determination? Are you seeing it at the same anticipated rate as your risk files? Or are you seeing a change in that over time? These are the opportunities for you to, again, go back and reevaluate your risk files to support your actions going forward. And again, timely investigations are needed to determine how the device was used, any other incidental information associated with the use of the device. Different kinds of investigations are required for different kinds of devices. Obviously, capital equipment on site, there's probably better information about that than if it was a disposable product, that you might not be able to get that device since it was disposed of. Or if a device is tied up in litigation, you may not be able to have access to it either from a liability perspective. Cdrh, Center for Devices, performs its own HHE, or they will use a precedent HHE if the same situation has arisen in the past. Only the center classifies your recalls. You do not classify it. You can anticipate the classification based upon access to FDA's database of recalls, the RES, the Recall Enterprise System, or the TPLC database on the Cdrh website. So HHEs really help the center identify how what class your recall will wind up being, whether it be Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3. Depending upon the particular situation at Cdrh, I've worked enough years at Cdrh where we've had one center director who felt any physician should be able to conduct an HHE. If they are a physician, they should fully understand it. Other center directors have said, no, we need a full committee to be able to provide input similarly to what you guys should be using as well. So it waxes and wanes as to how much exposure these HHEs get at FDA when they render that decision. So it's defining a risk. There are a number of factors that are associated with that. The technical assessment of the defect defines the likelihood of the device failure, and the clinical understanding helps clarify the risk associated with the use of that device failure. FDA assumes when they evaluate their HHE and evaluate your product, that no corrective action has been taken by the firm. They don't want to evaluate a situation where the firm has remediated the issue or put mitigations in place. They want to evaluate the problem that existed and prompted your action. And again, just because you don't have reported injuries doesn't mean lower risk or recall classification. You want to be proactive in these situations and reduce the opportunities for injuries or deaths and reduce your liabilities. The expectation is that when you identify a problem, that you investigate it appropriately, determine whether or not it does raise a risk to health, is it anticipated or not, and be proactive in taking the right action and making the right decision. Some of the challenges associated with Class 1 recalls that we've seen over time, issues where manufacturers can disconnect. Firms have the defects easily recognized by the physician. Workarounds are proposed and are either being done by surgeons or healthcare practitioners. They know how to deal with this. It's easy as can be. But again, going back to the earlier comments, that could be distracting the physicians. Other systems provide backup. So therefore, it's not as catastrophic. You have a backup system. If this fails, we have an alternative. Or there's alarming situations. Yeah, but we don't pay attention to alarms. It's more of an inconvenience versus evaluating the risk of prolonging or rescheduling an interventional or diagnostic procedure. Perhaps that procedure was an emergency procedure that had to be aborted because your device failed. It's not simply an inconvenience for scheduling. That patient may have already been exposed to anesthesia unnecessarily, which is of concern to the healthcare community today. Or misuse by healthcare providers. Physicians just don't understand their device. They don't know how to use it. Experts have no problem. Well, actually, the lack of expertise of design may indicate there's an instructions for use issue. It may be a design issue. Misuse by healthcare providers is not a rational excuse for not taking the appropriate action. Silent recalls, FDA has certainly identified a number of those where firms think that they're just correcting a problem without reporting it. Combining a product upgrade with a correction or a removal is a silent recall. Distributing a marketing bulletin that informs customers of recent device problems. Advise of techniques to be used to prevent those problems. You're working around that problem. That's a silent recall. Deploying sales reps to inspect devices in the field to see whether a problem is present, and if so, hey, just swap out these parts. Exchanging defective devices for customers who complain, fix on fail, the squeaky wheel, and not bother to expand that to those that did not complain. Or replacing problematic parts during routine service and not mentioning anything to it. We'll just catch it when it comes in next time. There have been a number of warning letters. These are just two examples. One is that you failed to submit your reports of correction removals within 10 days, and that resulted in a warning letter. And I can tell you districts are looking at those very seriously. And the second warning letter to MadRad was, again, it was a silent recall situation. They sent a safety reminder to healthcare practitioners that resulted in upgraded software. They released a disposable kit workaround. They never reported it to FDA. FDA considered that to be a silent recall because both those steps that they took did reduce a risk to health. Service activities, often forgotten by firms, but are part of your quality system, not a separate business unit. That may be a tremendous feeder of information about complaints, potential recall situations. Service reports should be closely trended. Same thing with routine service, replacement of parts. Parts usage should be tracked and trended on a routine basis to see if there are any spikes. And similarly, service provides many opportunities for what FDA would consider a silent recall. And you need to understand that if, parts are being swapped out because of a known problem during service and it wasn't reported, that would be considered a silent recall. So it should be carefully monitored by the quality organization within your firm. Some service activities that may be recalls, again, swapping out defective parts during the next preventive maintenance. Well, that's all well and good. What about those firms that aren't part of your preventive maintenance program? Again, a silent recall. Corrections, taking corrective actions during service visits. While you're out there, just swap out this part or upgrade this software because it does address a risk to health. Service reps providing installing parts on their own or fix and fail situations. Activities that might not be recalls, those parts that are replaced during normal routine service. You hopefully have a preventive maintenance schedule. You anticipate parts to be replaced on a regular scheduled basis. Those would not be considered recalls. That's normal routine servicing of the device. So here's a hypothetical. Again, the manufacturer device incorporates a bulb and its on-off switch that's expected life of 2 years. In their preventive maintenance schedule, these bulbs are replaced every 2 years. Isolated reports of bulbs have been failing at 22 and 23 months. Is that a recall or not? I would say no. That's pretty close to the expected life, and they're isolated reports. But steady reports have been coming in about failures at 8 to 9 months. That's no longer close, and they're steady reports. They're not isolated situations, and that would be considered a recall going forward. Another one, services are receiving an increased number of complaints about battery backup depletion. Upon return of the devices, the battery gauge indicates the battery is fully charged, sort of like your gas gauge on your car. Since this is a backup system and there have not been any complaints, those batteries that are reported depleted are removed, recharged, and reinstalled. So it's a false sense of security that you think you have battery backup and you don't. Is that a recall or not? Even though it's a backup system, it is a recall. That is certainly an indication that's of concern. We're going to quickly go through reporting corrections and removals. A lot of this is very prescriptive, and it's available in the Federal Register. Again, regulations that govern the reporting of medical device corrections and removals, promptly reporting in those 10 days is critical. If you cannot get all the information in and you do the best job you can, you're better off submitting 80% of the information on time than being late with 100% of the information. And if you become aware of new information, additional data, additional lots, additional products become involved, you can extend it to additional lots through supplements and amendments to the original 806 report. You do not have to start from scratch. It's not considered a second recall. There are tools available for you to be able to continue to feed information to FDA so that your recall is as effective as possible. We've been finding many FDA districts require filling out their own form and not necessarily limiting it to Part 806. In those situations, they ask you to just fill out their form and not follow Part 806, and that's fine. Part of those requests generally also include a request via health hazard evaluation. As I mentioned earlier, this came about because Congress was seeing that the industry was not abiding by the guidance document to report recalls. This was the first time the term recall ever appeared in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1990. But they saw the need to require reporting to FDA so that FDA had a thumbprint on how industry was doing, how products were performing in the marketplace, and that failure to report in a timely manner misbrands your device and subject to legal action, aside from the problem associated with your device that may also subject it to legal action. Again, not to repeat myself, risk to health tracks the definitions for Class 1 and 2 recalls. Reasonable probability the product will cause serious adverse health consequences or death, or may cause temporary and medically reversible health consequences, or where the probability of serious adverse health consequences is remote. They use the definitions for health consequences with serious injury. They use the MDR definition of 21 CFR 803.3 so that there is consistency in interpretation going forward. Again, based on the regulation, if you report a removal or correction under the MDR reporting requirements or under the radiation, the electronic products reporting mechanism, you in theory don't have to submit a separate corrections and removals. We encourage you to submit it anyhow. These often get lost in transition, and before you know it, FDA is on you for not reporting, and then you have to explain why you didn't report. Just easier and safer that you report those to the district in a timely manner. What's equally important, or even more important, is there are going to be non-reportable decisions. Those required by regulation also to be maintained in a file. You need to make sure that those are available for FDA review, because they will review those as well as your Class 3 recall decisions. Those are really critical, because those are the ones that you'll probably be challenged on. It's important that you document all your decisions and your basis for not reporting or for determining it's a Class 3 recall. Another quick hypothetical: which scenarios involve a recall that should be reported? Fast replaces customer stock super sleek cannula with a new model that handles easier and also resolves a problem that made the cannula prone to breaking inside the aorta. Is that a recall? Yes. Testing reveals a dangerous defect in one lot of the super sleek that has not yet reached customers, but has been sent to distribution centers. The manufacturer replaces all the stock at the distribution centers. Is that a recall? Possibly, depending upon who has control of that product. If that manufacturer is the one who determines which lots get released for sale, then it would be a stock recovery. If it's no longer under the ownership or the direct control of the manufacturer, it would be a recall. So again, the scenario depends on what the situation is. There was recently, FDA published a final enhancement versus recall guidance document on October of 2014. Guidance is to clarify when a change to a device constitutes a recall versus an enhancement. The difference between a recall, an enhancement and a recall needs to be, whether it needs to be reported under Part 806. Recalls are conducted for changes to violative devices. Enhancements are conducted for changes to non-violative devices. If you can build a better mousetrap, that is an enhancement. It is not a recall. If you're enhancing your device to address known complaints and problems associated with the use of that device, it is a recall. The guidance is written in Q&A format. It's very clear. The agency clearly changed its original intent from the proposed guidance, and it does make that interpretation much easier. It does not address when a change to a device requires a pre-market submission. That is handled under the 510K requirements and the 510K guidance. So changes intended to resolve a failure to meet specifications or a failure of the device to perform as represented would constitute a recall. There's a violation. The product doesn't meet specifications. It doesn't work as the label intended. The devices are adulterated. They're lesser quality. They purport to represent to possess. In the other example, changes to correct labeling that is false and misleading, fails to provide adequate directions for use, or otherwise violates labeling requirements would also be considered a recall. So the labeling itself is the problem. Labeling changes to non-violative devices, including additional warnings, would not be considered a recall. So as you become aware of situations where you want to provide additional warnings to the user, you're enhancing the use of the device, that would not be considered a recall. So in summary, and I know we moved quickly through this, there's also new FDA guidance that just came out in June of 2016, factors to consider regarding benefit risk in medical devices. This is a draft guidance. The comment period did close, but they will continue to accept comments. This clarifies how Cdrh will consider the benefit and risk of medical devices in these contexts. And this is for the first time they're talking about benefits of potential recall products. If there's a product scarcity, if a product would be removed from the market, product shortage situations, medical needs situations. Historically, the agency has always taken that position, but this sort of codifies and documents the decisions they've made. Compliance and enforcement, this will be used for both industry as well as FDA in determining benefit risk associated with the use of a device, a potentially violative device, by both FDA and industry in enforcement actions as well as recall scenarios. And consideration of benefit-risk trade-offs from a patient perspective. If a patient is totally familiar with the use of a device and it means they have to replace it with something else that they're not as accustomed to and might not be as risky, they may take that into account as well. Keep in mind, FDA has historically always looked at these situations as worst-case scenarios. So in a company's HHE, it opens opportunities to identify the benefits of a product. It's no longer just simply worst-case scenario, looking for that needle in a haystack and making rash decisions based upon you need to remove the product because there's a 1 in a million chance. It does now take into account a much broader approach. It does not, however, change the regulatory classification of recalls or change definitions of serious injury. It doesn't change your HHE strategy for categorizing the seriousness, or it doesn't resolve the issue of qualitative assessment versus numerical probabilities of likelihood of harm. It does increase the emphasis on duration of patient exposure to harm. It does increase emphasis on the estimation of harm upon patient exposure to a non-compliant manufacturer, not just a non-conforming device. So it is considering benefit risk in a broader fashion going forward. So in summary, there has been an increased focus on recalls. They are effective and an efficient way to manage a violative situation, reducing your risk of having to go to court, having filings filed with the Department of Justice. There's been a slight dip in recalls over the last couple of years. It's important that you know the requirements for device recalls. Be timely in your reporting. Have everything set up in advance of that unfortunate situation that if it does raise its head, you're well prepared, you know how to do it, you have the right people involved, the decisions are being made, and people are being held accountable. You should be familiar with distinguishing between a device recall and an enhancement. Again, need to make sure you document those decisions. It wasn't an ad hoc decision off the top of somebody's head. And always act in the best interest of public health. It will likely reduce your risk and liability over time. And then very clearly, the recalls by classification by fiscal year, you can see that those actually, the number, the axes sort of disappeared on this. I apologize. But it's roughly about 1,200 recalls for the last 2 years, just under 1,200 recalls. It spiked above that in the years 2011 and 14. But it is running somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 recalls a year. Class 3 recalls are the bottom modality, the orange section, and the Class 1 recalls are the gray section of that area. So you can see the bulk of them are Class 2. So with that, I know I run over time a little bit, but it does. I do welcome the opportunity for questions if you have any going forward.
Steve, that was wonderful. Thank you. That was a lot of great information. And I'm happy to turn now to the Q&A portion. Several of you have contacted us through the Q&A function, so it may be intuitive to you users as to how to do it, but just in case, if you want to submit a question, the Q&A panel is located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button, and be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the Ask menu. If you're shy, have no fear, because your questions will not be seen by all members of the audience. So with that, with those instructions, I will turn to a couple questions that we have, Steve. The first is preparing a complete Part 806 report takes time and considerable coordination within a firm. What if you don't have all the information needed within the 10 days reporting time frame?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Sarah, it's more important for you to get 80% of the information in on time than 100% of the information in late. You absolutely can amend your 806 reports. The worst thing you can do, however, is submit an 806 report to the agency with the name of the device and every step of that to be determined, to be determined, to be determined. That's of no value to the agency. It's of no value to you either, quite frankly. That's why I encourage firms to build in the information part of gathering 806s as much before you sign off on the decision to to undertake the recall. To the extent that you can bake it into your decision process, by the time you sign off on the decision to undertake that recall, you have already collected a lot of that information. Many times the biggest problem is distribution data. It's not always easily accessible, and the agency understands that, and they will continue to accept data with regard to it. Similarly, they understand it's important that you develop a good dialogue with your recall coordinator in the local district. They really are there to help you, and they do understand. They've seen much of this before, and they can provide you assistance.
Okay, thank you. All right, I've got another one for you, Steve.
Sure.
What are the most important factors that FDA looks for in determining recall effectiveness?
So recall effectiveness is an interesting, this is where documentation on your behalf is critical. When you issue a notification to a consignee about a recall, you should be as well providing a response card or response correspondence at some point that A, they've received your notification, they do or do not have recall product on hand, they have stopped using the recall product, or they are following your directions with regard to the recall notification, and that is then returned to you. All of that really needs to be documented in verifiable mail so that if any questions arise, you can handle that. Similarly, if you're not getting responses, you're expected to make at least 3 good faith efforts to obtain that information. But FDA will go out and do audits as well. And so you may have sent that piece of correspondence to the risk manager at the hospital, and FDA went and saw the procurement people with regard to the recall, and they have no idea about the recall. It's in those situations where FDA will come back to you and say, hey, Steve Niedelman Hospital was not notified of this recall, at which point you can pull out your correspondence and show effectiveness. Effectiveness, as far as FDA is concerned, it's not necessarily 100%. You can't expect to retrieve 100% of the product. You do the best you can in getting that product back or identifying where the recall product is. There are some, because the product's been out so long and you've just identified the problem, that you may only get back, or you may only get back 25% of the product, but that's the best you can do. It's 100% of the product that's out there. So there's no cut and dry figures itself. You just need to make sure you document all your activities and document all the attempts that you've made so that FDA is satisfied that, yeah, okay, they asked the wrong person the wrong question, and they are confident that you've gotten the appropriate response.
Okay. Here's another one, Steve. If a product improvement is made to adjust a safety feature on a product that some users are purposefully defeating, is this a recall situation?
You probably need, I hate to use the word, but it depends. So are you getting complaints about the use of this particular, are your directions correct? Is it just a better way to build the same mousetrap, and at the end of the day, you're getting the same output? You need to consider and evaluate all of that. I would hate to give a hard and fast answer to something that may have implications that go beyond a simple, high level question. If you know when your device was designed and you put your device on the market that this was the state of the art and this was the best you could do at the time the device was introduced to the market, and now you can do a better job, not necessarily because you're addressing complaints, but because you now have better expertise, there's more science available, there's more technology available, and you can build a better thing, and it could reduce some of those concerns that were originally known. And that's an enhancement. If you're modifying that because now we have complaints, we have injuries, we have situations, then I would have to say that could easily be seen as a recall by the agency. So again, I hate to use it, but it depends.
Okay, so, and Steve, I'm sort of adding this to the question. I'm assuming a lot of this is going to depend on what the underlying hazard is that the safety feature is designed to, the safety enhancement is designed to prevent.
Exactly. And was it considered initially, is it just you can do a better job now? It's not necessarily because it wasn't properly designed initially. There's a lot of factors that need to be evaluated. And that's why I hesitate to give a cut and dry answer, because I don't want somebody to go back to the agency and say Steve Niedelman said when I don't know the facts.
Okay. All right. Well, most of our listeners are still on, even though we've gone over, and there is at least 2 more questions, so I'm going to continue to pose them to you, Steve.
Sure.
Here's the next one. How do you handle consignees that refuse to cooperate during a recall if they do not respond to your recall notices? We know that FDA will require us to conduct effectiveness checks, and FDA will conduct audit checks. How do you handle these situations?
So again, it's important that you document your good faith efforts to notify these people. If, in fact, your distributor refuses to sub-recall their device, and, you know, we've seen a lot of aberrations with this. We've seen manufacturers that said, okay, if it's because, you know, it's too much trouble for you, we'll be glad to conduct that recall. We'll provide you the recall letter. We will even notify your consignees. There's some mistrust about that as well because there's concern that the manufacturer will steal their customers. There are a variety of reasons. If you're really having difficulty, it does not hurt to notify FDA that, you know, you're doing the best job you can. You want to make sure this recall is as effective as possible. It's in your best interest because you want to reduce your risk and your liability if people are continuing to get injured or there's a problem with the use of the device and it affects risk to health. So it's in your best interest. Let FDA know. They may decide to go visit that distributor and find out what's going on and why aren't they sub-recalling. They may decide to go visit some of those consignees that are not responding. You know, there are some firms, regrettably, that especially those firms that are undergoing extensive remediation as a result perhaps of consent decree, where customers fall into a pattern of what's known as recall fatigue. The firm has, due to a variety of reasons, not undertaken recalls in the past, and all of a sudden there's a flood of recall activity associated with a particular device. And before you know it, that same device is being recalled for a half a dozen to a dozen different reasons over a period of 6 to 9 months. And firms, you know, customers sort of grow tired and weary of those recalls. Like, what's next? Why are we still using this device? You know, this is just another one of their notifications, et cetera. So there are reasons that, you know, manufacturers really need to stay on top of. But you need to be vigilant. Don't hesitate, I might add, to use your sales staff, if necessary, to pay a personal visit to these people and say, how come you haven't responded? Do you no longer have the device? Don't you have the device, et cetera? I know sales staff do not like to deliver bad news, but sometimes the reality of it is somebody needs to get to the bottom of what is happening. But again, so be vigilant, document your decisions, document your actions, be sure to work with the agency if you see that this is becoming a problem. Don't let it go so far along that before you know it, you know, it's 2 years out, this recall is open, you still haven't gotten responses from anybody. I would be upfront with the agency and say, hey, look, here's what we've done. We've taken all the steps, and let the agency sort of help take it on at that point. Okay.
So there's one more question, and I think it's probably a bit related to the one before, but I'll let you be the judge of that, Steve. The question is a design change to the product to decrease its failure rate if there is no risk to health from the failures a recall?
So if the redesign is addressing an issue but there's no risk to health, I would argue at that point, as long as it wasn't to address complaints, especially complaints that were MDR reportable, I think you have a logical argument to be able to say it would not be reportable under Class 1 or 2. It would likely be a Class 3 situation. If you had complaints, and that's what drew you to the change, especially if those complaints were MDR reportable, where you're saying failure to correct, if it was a malfunction, failure to correct may result in serious injury or death, it's hard to argue that this does not raise a risk to health. So you need to be consistent in your decision making, and FDA has been connecting the dots on that more and more lately. We had connected those dots many years ago, and we've been seeing that in 483s recently as well, that how could you say this didn't raise a risk to health when you told us it would when you submitted that MDR? So either you need to calibrate your MDR decision process or you need to calibrate this. But in any event, you need to, you just need to act judiciously in these situations and, do the best job you can with it.
Thank you. And Steve, once again, a wonderful presentation. I always appreciate the work that you do for us. You're very generous with your time in our program. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. I hope people enjoyed it. And, if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.